Hello, and welcome to P&P Live at Lunch. I'm Heidi Lewis from Politics and Prose bookstore in Washington, D.C. We are so pleased to welcome Gene Ludwig to this virtual event today. And it's an auspicious day, as a matter of fact. As Housing Wire, a national news source for the mortgage and housing industry, has just named Gene as a recipient of the 2020 Vanguard Award based on his innovative service to the housing, mortgage, and finance industry. So welcome and congratulations, Gene. And we're excited to welcome him here to discuss his new book, The Vanishing American Dream, a frank look at the economic realities facing middle and lower income Americans, based on a symposium held at Yale Law School in April of last year. And Gene designed this bipartisan gathering of the nation's foremost economic thinkers, academics and politicians, CEOs and former presidential advisors, to break with convention and candidly discuss the widening gap between low and moderate income Americans and their wealthier counterparts. And this book captures the broad and experienced perspective of all those gathered and their thoughts on inequality and policy shortcomings, along with their ideas that have successfully narrowed the wealth gap from government investment to the role of the private sector. As co-founder, along with his wife, Dr. Carol Ludwig of the Ludwig Institute for Shared Economic Prosperity, Gene has spent his life advocating for the economic well-being of all Americans. He's an economic thought leader who has worked in both the public and private sectors, including as CEO and founder of Promontory Financial Group and former US Comptroller of the currency under Bill Clinton. He's joined today by two distinguished guests, both of whom contributed to the 2019 symposium, Daniel Markovits and Mary J. Miller. Daniel Markovits is the Guido Calabresi Professor of Law at Yale Law School and founding director of the Center for Study of Private Law. He's also the author of The Meritocracy Trap: How America's Foundational Myth Feeds Inequality, Dismantles the Middle Class, and Devours the Elite. Mary J. Miller, who served at the US Treasury from 2010 to 14, including as Undersecretary for Domestic Finance, implementing financial regulatory reforms and post-recession economic recovery measures, is currently a senior fellow with the Johns Hopkins 21st Century Cities Initiative. Before I bring them all onto the screen, I want to thank everyone in the audience for tuning in today and for your support of our bookstore. It's a difficult time for everyone, but I'm aware that many of you donated to the store to join our chat today, and of course, have purchased Gene's book from our store. If you haven't already, I encourage you to buy this stirring and important new book, which really nails the inequality equation and provides actionable insights for a more equitable way forward. As ever, please log your questions for the author and his guests into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, as they will take your questions before our hour ends today. I'll also keep the chat box open for discussion, which is where I will drop the buy links to Gene and Daniel's books. And I encourage you to use the chat to deepen the conversation today and to enjoy this experience. So please help me welcome Gene, Daniel, and Mary onto the screen for our virtual bookstore event today. And thank you all so much, and welcome to Politics and Prose.
Well, Heidi, thank you very much. And let me say, this is really a treat for me because I'm a Politics and Prose devotee and fan, more or less a neighbor. And the only thing I can say that I'm sad about today is I can't enjoy a mug of a Politics and Prose soup and a sandwich, as well as wander around the bookstore as part of this experience. Let me say a word about the book, and then I want to say a word about Mary and Daniel and ask them a couple of questions. First, about the book. The concept for the book came to me when I visited my hometown in York, Pennsylvania. I grew up in Amish country, Pennsylvania. And when I went up to visit, about 5, 6 years ago, the place was materially less vibrant than it was when I was growing up as a kid, 40, 50 years ago. And you could see that the major industries which were local were closed. A place where the lore was that no banks closed during the Depression was paint peeling, things clearly declining. And that coincided with my own experience here in Washington, D.C. For 43, 44 years, I've either walked by, bicycled by, or ridden by the Federal Reserve on the way home from my office. And the only thing that's really materially changed in terms of visuals is the growing tent city of homeless people, which you can see if you get on the Whitehurst Freeway. So just feels like decline. I then began to look at the situation economically, and I hired a young economist from Yale, and the numbers began to look really horrifying for middle and low income Americans. And it looked like it was a long-term trend, at least dating into the 70s, where middle and low income Americans were headed down. The trend was so upsetting. And as I looked into the situation so approaching dire, that I then thought, well, that's how I see it. But these are always blind man and elephant experiences in life. So let's get together a group of super duper economists, right, left, center, folks who had been in the public sector, private sector, including business people, to get together and see what the shared experiences were. As it turns out, this was about the time a number of books were coming out on the subject, like Hillbilly Elegy, which is sort of the, but they tended to be anecdotal, very good, but anecdotal, and we're not exactly about a declining American dream. They're really focused on segments of the society really in trouble. So we had this symposium, and I continued to do research, a bit of which will come out in the days and months ahead, which will be even more shocking than one would imagine. And the book, in one sense, not because of its organizer, me, is really worth reading because you're not just getting the views of the contributors who are really exceptional intellects like Mary and Daniel, but when we had the symposium, we had not intended to do a book, and I decided with everybody's approval to record it for posterity, because it's unusual you get Nobel Prize winners and mayors and governors and a whole bunch of people together. When it was over, it was so inspiring and worthwhile, and such an interesting dialogue about this problem, that we asked everybody whether or not, if we put a book together and had the a symposium dialogue captured exactly the way it was, with people, editing for grammar, we could do that. And everybody said yes. So when you read the book, you should get the sense of being there, because this is not, homogenized. This isn't through a filter. You're going to get people's views like Mary and Daniel as they expressed it to their colleagues. And and what was really interesting was, number one, the symposium was set up, and the book is set up, in terms of three question areas. One, is it as bad as I think it is? And if so, why? That was one segment. What would you do about this problem from a national perspective? And what would you do about it from a local perspective? Because there are certain national solutions that actually are harmful for local environments, and certain local things that need to be done that don't necessarily have a national implication. So that was the architecture of the book, and it is the architecture in the book. To draw a finer point when you say, because I think it's a good place to start, how bad is it? And why? I would say this is the one area. There was a remarkable amount of agreement about the problem and its solutions. It wasn't by any means entire agreement. Different people, different points of view. That's what makes it fun. But there's a remarkable agreement that there was a real problem here that everybody saw and agreed was very serious in terms of the vanishing American dream and the decline of middle and low income Americans over the last several decades, A. And B, there was a remarkable actual agreement that we had to act vigorously in the months and years to come. Now, you might say, well, look, when I read this, and this is one of the areas that I myself am most focused on. When you read the headline statistics for the last several decades, with some notable exceptions like the Great Crisis of 2007, it would seem as if things are largely better, right? GDP seems to go up, unemployment seems to go down, and while there's CPI price inflation, net, wages according to the CPI seem to be rising. So what's the big problem? And you can describe it in a number of different ways, but every time you look into it over a long period of time, it's decline, decline, decline. And therefore, one of the takeaways from the books is got to be, I think you will agree when you read it, that the headline statistics are correct in terms of government putting out accurate statistics, but they are misleading and they are not relevant for these purposes. I'll give you an example of just one area. So it is true that CPI adjusted wages, that is real wages, have increased over the period of 1960 through 2019. And the CPI, that is the inflation, that's CPI is the consumer basket of goods and services, it's the inflation figures we hear, has increased. But adjusted, it looks like wages are up. So we think things of those measures would be good. But in fact, the goods and services that middle and lower income Americans most need to basically have the American dream for themselves and their children, that is a bettering life, the things that they most need have gone up exponentially. So to give you an example, healthcare since 1960, the cost of healthcare for middle and lower income Americans has increased 23.4 times. That's not a percentage, 23.4 times more expensive to deal with healthcare today than in 1960. Housing up 11.7 times. And tuition, I used Penn State. So I'm a Pennsylvania boy, and as I say, you read the book, I talk about York, Pennsylvania, Amish country, Pennsylvania. So Penn State, like one of the great American inventions, land-grant colleges, was the way out to achieve a better dream for middle and low-income Americans because it was affordable. And when I was in school, many of my high school friends went there. But the tuition at Penn State is up since 1960, 35.3 times. Now, CPI has only been up 8.67 times. And while wages have risen, for middle and low income Americans, they haven't come close to the increase in costs in the key categories that are needed to have the American dream be a reality for you and your families. And so, that's the nexus of the problem. And you can describe that elephant in a variety of different ways, depending whether you're looking at the ear, the trunk, or the tail. But it still comes out to the same elephant in the room, a big problem for America. Now, in terms of both what the problem looks like, how to get us out of the mess we're in, I have some thoughts myself. But before, and many reflected in the book, because the book will suggest different points of view as to what those solutions are. Let me turn this over to Daniel and Mary. I want to say a quick word about both. Daniel, of course, has come out with a new book that Heidi mentioned to us, and it would be a good companion along with The Vanishing American Dream, which, of course, parochially, I'd hope you'd buy first. No apologies, Daniel. but it's a good book. So since the symposium, Daniel will not only have thoughts about the symposium, but what's happened since, what are some of the solutions, what should we be doing to get America back? And Mary who, and of course with his professorial role dealing with students at Yale Law School in and of itself is a window into, an interesting cohort of young people. Mary has not only had a distinguished career prior to the time of the symposium, but an enormously exciting since. I knew Mary first, I think, when she was Undersecretary of the Treasury, though I've known T. Rowe Price forever because I've been to Baltimore many times as I will say this with a certain amount of pride, very poor Peabody Conservatory trombone student.
I didn't know that about you.
If you want to learn about trombone, see Gene. But Mary, after the symposium, ran for mayor of the city of Baltimore. Now, that's an enormously courageous thing to do because Baltimore, as we all know, is a wonderful city, but with its challenges economically. And running for mayor for someone who has not run for public office before, I think, Mary, that's
true.
Is a tremendous challenge in terms of energy and all the things that come with running for public office and putting yourself in the limelight. But it also gives you a window on what's going on in middle and lower income America in a big American city that will be, I think, fascinating for our listeners today. So with that, let me turn it, maybe first over to Mary and then Daniel to say a word about their symposium and post-symposium experiences and their thoughts about, how to have the American dream not vanish.
Thank you, Gene, and thank you, Politics and Prose. I would like to invite you to open a bookstore in Baltimore. I will be your first and best client, so we could use you over here. Please consider that. Thank you for the opportunity today. Gene, the last year has been so momentous. It really is now about 16 months, I think, since we all gathered in New Haven to have that discussion. And we have so far in this hour not even mentioned the words pandemic or COVID. But when I was in New Haven, I was really thinking about this city, and I'll be pretty place-based in my comments, and the fact that over a decade since the financial crisis, we've made literally no progress in changing the percentage of people living in poverty, which hovers around 25% in Baltimore. And I'm virtually certain today, after all that's happened in the last 6 months, that that figure is even higher. This is a city that has really been left behind, maybe in some of the ways you've talked about York, but it is a post-industrial city that has not been able to regenerate economic development and growth to improve the lives of its citizens. And it really is what drove me to run for mayor, to think about new ways to try to change the trajectory and experience that mobility from poverty that we talk about. And the pandemic, of course, has intervened since then, and I think has only exacerbated inequality in Baltimore. It's so much more evident now in healthcare outcomes in the city, in food insecurity, transportation issues, online education for children, and the disparate quality of that. We have a lot of work to do, and we have even more work to do than when we gathered now more than a year ago to try to better the lives of people. I think we'll get into it over the course of an hour. I would say last year I was really focused on the financial capacity of Baltimore to grow, and I talked in the seminar about the impact of bank consolidation and how it had impacted small businesses and access to credit, and how that was making it harder for people to create jobs in the city. This year, I've turned my attention to the concept of digital equity and the fact that the pandemic has made it even more clear how divided this city can be when you don't have access to the internet, when you don't have access to education, to telemedicine, to job search capacity. I think that's another great concern to me in thinking about how we can lessen the differences in society. So I'll stop there. I've thrown out a few things, mentioned a few things, but let me turn to Daniel and let you weigh in here.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Politics and Prose. Thanks, Gene. Lovely to be here with you, Mary. Let me just say also, Gene, thanks for convening the event in New Haven, maybe 18 months ago now almost. It was actually, in the literal sense, extraordinary for having people from the left, the center, and the right all there, for having people who are principally thinkers and people who are principally doers all there. And in spite of all those differences, I had the feeling that every participant was engaging everybody else while being fully him or herself, which is really hard to pull off. And the book reflects that engagement across deep difference and diversity in a really powerful way. I guess I want to just make 3 points. First, just to chime in entirely, Gene, on your point about the divergence between the elite and the middle class. The past 5 decades have been terrific for the American elite. They've been at best stagnant and probably diminishing for everybody else, for middle and working class Americans in particular. The richest 1% has doubled its share of national income since 1970. Second point, the bulk of that difference comes from a transformation in the labor market and labor income. It is true that capital has captured a greater return of America's wealth than it used to, but in spite of that fact, 3/4 of the increase in the top 1%'s national income share comes not from a shift of income away from labor and towards capital, but from a shift of income within the labor distribution, away from mid-skilled, middle-class, working-class labor, and towards super elite labor, towards law firm partners who make $5 million a year, towards CEOs who make $10 or $15 million a year, towards bankers and hedge fund people who make $15, $20, $100 million a year. That's labor income, and it's captured by a narrowing and narrowing slice of Americans, even as ordinary wages are basically stagnant. At the same time, the country has experienced a parallel transformation in the education system, in which an education system that was distinctive across the world for being relatively egalitarian. From 1900 to 1970, the US was remarkable for providing a quality education to a higher percentage of its citizens than any other country in the world. Race and racism was a blight on that part of American life. But even taking race into account, the United States was distinctive in the share of its population, that it gave a high quality education. And since then, what's happened is that the divergence between the amount that's invested in educating the richest Americans and the amount that's invested in educating everybody else has grown and grown and grown, so that at this point, the difference between what's spent on educating a typical child from a 1% household and what's spent on educating a middle-class child amounts to the equivalent of a traditional inheritance for the rich kid in excess of $10 million per child. That difference in the education system is driving the divergence in the labor market. To get the jobs that pay these enormous sums, you need to have the educations that overwhelmingly only rich kids get. So that's the second point. And then the third point is just that, as Mary said, the pandemic has dramatically exacerbated both of these phenomena. In the labor market, elite white-collar workers are able to continue working not entirely unhindered, but effectively, equivalently successfully to the way in which they could work before. They Zoom, they work from their offices, they move in-person meetings to online meetings, they continue to be paid, they continue to have their jobs. Whereas most of the rest of the workforce has taken an enormous hit to its employment and its productivity and its wages in circumstances in which those jobs are being revealed as being absolutely essential to the well-being of society. At the same time, in education, elite schools, elite private schools are able effectively to deliver almost the same quality education online that they could deliver in person. Some of them are delivering education in person by buying testing machines and keeping the pandemic out of their classrooms. Others have students who have incredibly good broadband, also very importantly, clean, quiet, well-lighted private places to study and work, and parents and tutors who can help them work online. Whereas in the mass of the public system, particularly outside of rich suburbs, it's become almost impossible to deliver effective education. So much so that some education data scientists calculated that just last spring's disruption was the equivalent of losing roughly half a year of schooling for the average public school kid in America. And so you're getting all of the divergences and inequalities that we've been suffering for 50 years compounded and concentrated as a result of this disease. And I think that's enough for me to say right now to get the conversation going. But just to emphasize, accord with both of what you've said in the main.
Well, that's both fascinating, and it does remind me in terms of both the civil dialogue and the interesting or trialogue we're having, as we said earlier, that how valuable it is to get the different points of view to see this picture more clearly. Two threads in the book that are, I think, worth reading and thinking about. One, I think almost everybody agreed with a Bob Schiller direction reflected in other books, by the way, written by people at the symposium like Jacob Hacker, which is that prior to about 1970, there was a better shared American vision among business and government than there has emerged since. And, certainly more collegiality in the Congress, and Mary may want to comment on that. The second thing that I thought was interesting in terms of, I think, genuinely shared agreement was of education. I don't think anybody disagreed that a better education for middle and low income Americans was essential. And maybe even more so in terms of what that education means, and I'm certainly deeply of this view, is jobs. At the end of the day, it's good jobs, good jobs, good jobs. And by good, I only mean well-paying, that you can get a living wage, not that there's a difference in terms of, somebody who's doing a fancy office job and somebody who is not, but just the fact you can have a living wage. And there, we are so far away from even where we were, let alone I think where everybody would like to get. It's astonishing. Actually, if we were to get the new minimum wage law, the number, I think it's $15 that was the benchmark, it actually is less in terms of inflation rate than we had as a minimum wage 30, 40 years ago. So that's astounding. That's sort of running hard to go backwards. So my own view on this, and that's sort of tip off for, Mary and in terms of what to do, I would invest. If I was running America like a business, I would basically do what businesses do that want to basically increase productivity and increase the well-being of the company. I would invest in the business, and that's how you get increased revenues. Here, I would invest in America, and by investment, I think we've got to invest in infrastructure, particularly those portions of the infrastructure that give low and moderate income people a better chance of having a good job and getting ahead. For example, transportation. If you live in an inner city, you can't get to the jobs except for 2.5 hours, or you live in Appalachia, you can't get to the jobs. The lack of infrastructure really hurts. And in that regard, everybody would agree, invest in education. The symposium also, there was a fellow, Marshall McLuhan, who wrote a book that I'm sure Politics and Prose has or can get about 30, 40 years ago. So the messages in the medium. And it seems to me, if the symposium, you read the book and you say, this was kind of interesting or worthwhile, the messages in the medium, getting people of different political persuasions and different walks of life to work together towards a common goal is something, in my view, America has to do if we're actually going to move forward. So the book will reflect a number of these themes. And in that regard, I'd like to ask Mary, first and then Daniel, what would you do? You see Baltimore. How would you move Baltimore forward, so that there is a greater chance that citizens of that city can embrace a better future for themselves and their children.
Sure. You said a lot there and got my brain moving in many directions, but let me try to address that specifically. I think bottom line, we need to raise income in the city. And we can do that if we improve our educational system and the prospects for graduates to either go on to college and get the types of jobs and income that Daniel's talked about, or to leave high school and go directly into an apprenticeship or job that will be a middle class income or better. It troubles me immensely when I hear manufacturers in the city say, I cannot find a single person who's qualified to take a job in my company, because those jobs pay very good wages. And it tells me that something is broken in our educational system, our job training systems, that we cannot supply workers for jobs that will give them that income. So, my instincts are very much towards economic development done in a more modern way. I'm very familiar with a company here that uses algorithms now to test for raw ability to code in entry-level technology work. The company ignores educational attainment. It looks past a criminal record. It's simply looking for raw talent. They've been remarkably successful in finding those coding skills, which, by the way, I don't have at all. I would never get a job at this company. And lifting people from very, very low incomes to very good, solid incomes. And that's sort of bridging a whole host of problems. Looking past a poor education system and, a host of social problems to give someone the opportunity to work and to work in a way that they can have, a meaningful job and income. So I always come back in my mind to income as the best way to begin solving poverty problems, narrowing the income divide, but beginning to solve other problems like access to healthcare, access to transportation. I'll give you one anecdote on transportation, because the pandemic has, of course, dramatically reduced ridership on public transportation. 40% of people in Baltimore do not own a car. This is a huge issue. The state, which runs our transportation system, proposed cutting public transit service by 20% because of the low ridership. This is sort of a death spiral of public transportation, because then you make everything worse with less access to work, less access to healthcare, less access to schools. So fortunately, that was overturned by an uproar from the public here. But we do need to think. We need to think very, holistically from a public policy standpoint of how can we deliver economic development, job creation, and raise income. If that is the biggest issue I think facing us here.
And Mary, I'll be guilty of leading the witness, which Daniel will understand that is a.
I'm in the grip of two lawyers here. This is terrible.
And that is,
if you can get away with it, it's a virtue.
Yeah. Mary, you also had an interesting view about the use or lack of availability of technology in Baltimore, which I think is perhaps emblematic of all low and moderate income city centers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't want to be entirely negative here, because I think in some measure the pandemic has driven the need to a place where we wouldn't have gotten to as quickly. This year, we've probably provided Chromebooks, devices, tablets to about half of the public school system children, with a goal of getting to 100% during this academic year and hopefully by the end of this calendar year. That happened in a matter of months. That is remarkable, because we did not have an online learning experience for public school children. So, a pandemic, a crisis drove a remarkable response in helping that happen. We still don't have good internet access. We don't have stable broadband in the city. And there's lots of patchwork things in place to try to make that happen. But I do think that closing this technology divide is part of the key to closing the income inequality in the country. And I'm more and more convinced of that the more I look into it here, of what it means to get that done.
Now, Daniel, you'll have a lot to say, I think, about education. We have a lot to say about everything in terms of your book and your studies. But can you give us a sense as to what you think in terms of the educational changes that we need for middle and low income Americans, or need generally, that will give them the boost that is necessary here? How would you focus? Career readiness, more access to college courses, more technology. And indeed, in that regard, I'd ask you, one interesting comment you made at the symposium, which is that there's high-end inequality too. It's not just low-end inequality and problems, but that's interesting thought that you had, but less central to how do we get middle and low-income Americans out of this slide.
Yeah, so I think this is a key point, and it's also a great place to illustrate both the way in which fundamental political differences are going to drive different kinds of responses, and the way in which we can have meaningful engagement across the differences. So, I come at this question from significantly further to the left, Mary, than you do. And what that means is that I am in practice inclined to think that we need larger, more structural reforms, and reforms that are probably going to be less congenial to the elite. But at the same time, the sorts of measures that you're talking about are incredibly important, and if correctly administered, can make a material difference to people's lives. And so it's a mistake for people like me to neglect those sorts of measures, even as we also mention others. So what am I talking about more structural reform? So I'd say two things. First, about technology and the pandemic and the classroom. It is totally true that the technological divide between the rich and the rest is very damaging to the educational prospects of people outside the elite, especially now. And there's no way people can do distance learning if they don't have machines and good connectivity. At the same time, I also think that getting people those things is not close to sufficient for getting the educational opportunities they need. That the other thing that people need is quiet, safe, clean places to work, alone without disturbance from siblings, and especially for younger kids, but also for teenagers, early teenagers, in the presence of adults who are able to calm the nerves when something gets difficult, resolve a squabble, right the ship in the middle of the day when the ship starts listing, as it does for children. I speak now as a parent of school-age children, and there's no way that's possible without a deep base of cultural, social, and material privilege in the household. And giving tech to kids in families and in households and in buildings and apartments where people are cramped on top of each other, where parents can't be home because they've got to be out in dangerous conditions working in order to make rent, where there are 3 siblings in one room, is not a recipe for educational achievement for those kids, no matter how good the tech is. Now, what would I do about that? One thing I think that's essential is to take the enormous resources that the US spends on education, concentrated on its richest citizens, and spread those around so that less money is spent on the rich, so that rich schools are encouraged or even forced to open up to less privileged kids in a variety of ways. The US is one of only 3 OECD countries in which the public system spends more per child on rich kids than on poor kids. All the other rich countries in the world effectively spend more per child on poor kids than on rich kids. That's because largely we have local funding of public schools. So one thing to do is to find a way to put the brakes on local funding of public schools. Deprive public school systems of the tax advantages that they currently enjoy deprive elite private schools of the tax advantage that they currently enjoy unless they open themselves up to large numbers of kids from outside of the elite. So that's noticed a much more structural and more radical move, which reasonable people can object to for a variety of reasons, ranging from political practicability to its infringement on liberty. My own view is that we won't get out of the problem in a really successful way without addressing those kinds of structural inequalities, which is not to say that the kinds of more targeted, narrow reforms that you're proposing are unimportant or insignificant. They're important and significant. The question is whether they're enough.
Oh, I feel like I was scratching, one problem right now, an immediate problem in front of us, which is how do we get through the school year this year, and how do we not have a class of students fall even further behind? So I'd be happy to engage with you on some of the broader structural reforms. I think school funding is a huge issue in my state and my city, and that's something that we've attacked.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. That is one of the things I think the book is most interesting about, is that this difference between local solutions and narrow solutions, which are real solutions and real solutions for real people,
right,
that are not broad and sweeping, but also the need for broader and more sweeping changes as well, but that there is really a difference. And
just to say, a key point is, in a world in which there's limited political energy, where to devote one's attention and resources is a big choice.
I agree with that. And in a sense, one of the problems with solving the problem, we were discussing this in a little chit chat we had before this session opened at Politics and Prose. And there, if you were to solve, for example, the educational problems in New Haven, Connecticut, or maybe in downtown Baltimore, and if you didn't have a 50-point economic plan for Baltimore, but you just said, look, I'm going to go into Baltimore and every kid is going to get the best education in the entire country. They're going to come out of Baltimore. Everybody's going to be ready to go to the Yale Law School. The problem would be, given the state of Baltimore, you'd have a high percentage of these kids wouldn't come back. And it wouldn't necessarily be supportive for the economic well-being of Baltimore. So, how you tailor national and local solutions has implications that can have profound difficulties, because then you can make the lives of everybody else worse in the local area, not better. And the book discusses that. Now, I'd be very interested in asking Mary and Daniel a little bit about this set of issues in terms of are there, and this is a little hard on everybody, are there narrow or broad solutions that you think we're gonna have a new Congress, a new president, whether it's the same president but for a new 4 terms or in a few months, in a month, and inaugurated in January. So you got 4 years to make a change, and that's going to be true in terms of state houses and governorships in certain states. You got 4 years or 2 years, whatever you got. What are you going to do that is going to make a big difference in people's lives? And so I want to ask both Mary and Daniel, what are you going to do that both has a practical opportunity of making a big difference, and is, off the top of your head, where you think the biggest difference can be made if you are now Mary Miller, President of the United States?
I think just at a very basic level, I think we should raise the minimum wage in the country. We should do that at the national level. It's very hard to do that at the local level and have to worry about being competitive. A few years back, Baltimore tried to raise the minimum wage and did not do so because the surrounding jurisdictions were not raising their minimum wage, and there was just a fear of being uncompetitive. And I think that needs to be tackled at the national level. And for all the reasons you talked about, we've fallen so far behind in real terms, in terms of basic income. So I would certainly do that. I think a lot about retirement security. When I was in the government, I helped design a retirement savings program for low-income, seasonal, part-time workers with no access to an employer retirement plan. It was very minimalist. It's not the full answer, but I do think we need to start thinking much more concretely about retirement security and giving people a path to building some resources for retirement. I don't think Social Security is the answer for providing for people in retirement. So I think those are two things that I would certainly think about. And just a random thought, completely off the map of what we've talked about. I never understood when I was in the government why we can't increase the gasoline tax in this country, which hasn't been touched in decades. Our cars have become much more fuel efficient. We have desperate infrastructure needs. That's an economic development plan for the country. I would tackle that. So I'll throw those three things out.
Daniel?
So two things. First, I entirely agree about the minimum wage. It needs to be raised. I'm not sure $15 is enough for reasons that you gave, which is that it's not as much as it used to be in real terms. I think it should be raised as part of a systematic program to promote mid-skilled middle-class work. So combined with wage subsidies, combined with tax preferences for people who create jobs for middle-class workers. Right now, the single highest tax factor of production in the economy is a middle-class worker, because the way in which Social Security tax operates with a ceiling on the Social Security tax base means that somebody who's making $80,000 a year pays a marginal tax rate in aggregate substantially higher, certainly than someone in finance who can get carried interest treatment, and even than many others who are paid much more, which is an enormous incentive for employers to replace 20 $80,000 a year workers with one $1.6 million a year worker and robots and algorithms. And our incentive should be pushing in the opposite direction. So a systematic labor market policy aimed at promoting and paying middle-class workers. And then on the schooling side, I think what I would do is, first of all, take away the tax-exempt status of all private schools and colleges unless they admit an economically diverse student body. Princeton University's tax exemption last year was worth, by one estimate, $100,000 per Princeton student per year. That's a public subsidy paid by middle-class taxpayers, compared to a public subsidy at the State University of Rutgers of $12,500 a year, and at Essex County Community College of $2,500 a year. So Princeton kids get a bigger public subsidy than community college kids in New Jersey by a factor of 40, even though there are more kids from the richest 1% in Princeton's student body than from the bottom 60%. So on the education side, I would get rid of those massive public subsidies for private kindergartens, private elementary schools, private high schools, private colleges, and also for elite, suburban, rich public sectors, which are in effect private schools, just structured around exclusive zoning communities. So those are the two things I would do on the education side and the labor market side, dramatically to increase the opportunities of middle-class people.
Now I have a question here. Please, folks, submit your questions, the listeners. The first question is, and I'll apologize in advance for using this gentleman's name since it's not anonymous, but it's really flattering. I hope it is for you, Mary and Daniel. It certainly is for me that the first question comes from Norm Ornstein, who is one of the leading political thought, bipartisan commentators, thought leaders in America, and somebody of considerable stature himself. He asks, we are likely to have an HR1 and an S1 in January, a hugely ambitious recovery package. Given that it appears nothing will be done now, which I think looks to be odds favor that, what ballpark figure do you think will be required to accomplish some of the ambitious goals you have all outlined? And can much of the agenda be included in that package? It's a really two-part question. How much is it going to cost, and how much could be included in an HR1 or an S1? Let me give you my 2 cents on it, which may or may not be hugely unpopular, as opposed to just unpopular. I think we have to think in the trillions of dollars, and whether it's 4, 5, 6, 10, I don't think it matters. I think it matters that we invest in the country and get the job underway and done as best we can, as quickly as you can. If you say to me, oh my goodness, that's crazy, where's the money? We have spent more time arguing about what taxes are and where the money's coming from than we have getting the job done. And in that regard, I am drawing myself to World War II and post-World War II. And I think we have to take a wartime stance and mentality to the serious problem we have for our middle and low income citizens. And we've got to solve this problem. We can't solve, America's really in serious, serious trouble. After World War II, Dwight Eisenhower's president, I think one of the greatest Americans in American history, great general during the troubled time, and a very strong president. He inherits the greatest debt to GDP ratio, I think, of the century, maybe since the revolution, or maybe it's measurable, but huge. What does he do? He invests in America. He gets the Highway Trust Fund. He realized, having been a Kansas City boy, you got to get highways to every part of America if you're going to enliven America. So he doesn't basically pull in the horns. He basically pushes out towards a big vision for America in that regard. We're in even worse shape, I think, actually, for a variety of reasons. And we've got to push out, but we have enormous opportunities too, because we are in the midst of a technological revolution, the likes of which nobody has ever seen in civilized times. This information revolution, I do a great deal in financial technology, and it is amazing what young people are coming up with, transformational changes. And so I don't think it matters how big it is. I think we have to think as big as we can. We'll get the money. If we put people back to work and they're working and paying taxes and they're paid decent wages and fairly, and by the way, Daniel, I thought you said a mouthful and are deeply right. The notion that people who are the initial workers are paying disproportionately higher taxes in the employment tax than somebody above a ceiling that all of a sudden isn't taxed with the payroll tax is absolutely outrageous. But forget tax equity. Let's just invest in America, give people well-paying, good jobs. They'll pay the taxes, we'll move forward. That's my 2 cents. I think something we can do together. And I think Norm's right. HR 1 or S1 is the time to do it, because whoever is in office will have a couple of years to really get something moving. Now, Mary, you've been in government, and Daniel, you have big ideas. What do you guys think?
Daniel, do you want to go first this time? I feel like
I'm happy to say something first, then you can tell me from experience why it's hopelessly impracticable, because I have never been in government. So I agree, Gene, it's a big number. I don't know if it's 2 trillion, 4 trillion. It's a big number, and I agree that we can debt finance a portion of it. I've argued in the past and renew the argument now that we can finance a big chunk of it actually through a one-time wealth tax. That's a sort of wartime idea of shared sacrifice in the face of this catastrophe, where the sacrifice right now has fallen entirely outside of the elite, and the elite can pay its share. And just to give a sense with round numbers, if we had a $2.5 million exemption of household wealth, that would mean that the bottom 95% of the wealth distribution would pay no tax at all. And that would be able to raise about $2 trillion in one go, one time. And because it's a one-time tax triggered by a once-in-a-century pandemic, it would have almost no distortionary effect on savings or capital formation in the long term. So I would raise money that way, and then I would spend it on the kinds of labor market and education interventions that we're talking about. The only thing I want to add is, although there will be an initial statute, many of the changes that need to be made go to not just where the government spends its money or who gets what kind of support, but also to the regulatory and legal institutional structures that govern everything that we do. And those changes are going to take longer to make. You know, we need to re-empower workers. We need to help unions get stronger again. We need to change the way education is delivered, to whom and what circumstances. And money will get us out of the immediate bind, but on a 2 to 10 year horizon, those are structural changes that are going to require systematic, disciplined political action.
Mary, very good.
So no question in my mind that we need a further fiscal response to the situation we're facing in the economy right now. I think of it in terms of twofold. The first being we need to get right back to work on a safety net to help people who have lost income, are still unemployed, have lost access to, eviction protection, rental, succession protection, all of that, because I think we're facing a really brutal winter. And I think that we need to get that in place right away. I can't exactly size that, but I think getting some more support out there quickly will be paramount.
Here.
The second part of it is really just this idea of making investments in people and in infrastructure. I worry about the national debt a lot. That used to be my job. We are in a very low interest rate environment, which makes that more palatable right now. But I think about borrowing for operating deficits differently than borrowing for investments in infrastructure and the types of investments you can make that are going to create jobs and opportunity long term. So I think you're asking a big question, Gene. Are we still the country that built the beautiful national park system in this country, the country that built the interstate highway system and so many more infrastructure improvements? Why can't we go back to that again? Why can't we take on some big projects that would be investments that are going to help our economy over the long term, but in the short term, create important jobs for people and income for people? I would like to see a sizable package, and I think it's got to have those two elements. It's got to have the immediate safety net, and it's got to have the longer term investment aspect to it. And I think that will be politically palatable to many people.
Terrific. We are just about at our time. So I don't know whether Heidi wants me to continue with questions or she wants to wrap up.
I think it would be great to take another question and maybe just to pose one final question to both of your guests.
Okay, terrific. I do not see. I will say, by way of a comment, not a question, but let's turn it into a question, because I deeply agree with this, is that the partisanship that we're living through today is one of the underbellies of the problem in terms of where we are. And that was in essence, the comment of an anonymous questioner. And I thought a very good one. Let's see. Whether or not, yeah, it doesn't look like there's another question on the chat.
There was also a note about what the commentary, what are your thoughts relevant to significant challenges in rural areas? Okay,
Let's ask that, and at the same time we ask the question, what do we need to do to get back to the kind of civility that we had only 20 years ago? When I was confirmed as controller of the Senate Banking Committee and the House Banking Committee, these were places that were largely bipartisan. The financial committees were not places, war zones. They were, there was differences of opinion, God knows, but they were much more collegial than anything we are living through it all today. What do you think, Mary, and what do you think, Daniel, both about that and also rural America, which God knows is deeply important, deeply troubled right now?
I'll just say quickly on the rural America, I appreciate the fact that my focus is quite urban, and I tend to think a lot about my hometown. But I think rural poverty is as great and in some ways different than urban poverty. And I think some of the dimensions of that are captured differently in legislation and policy. And I think we have to absolutely be attentive to both and to think about what are the different problems in space that is not dense and what are the challenges that occur in political jurisdictions that are built very differently than cities. So that would be a much longer conversation to have right now, but I acknowledge the point and say that we have to think about this in both dimensions.
Here.
And on the politics, I can say
one statistic, Mary, in your Pennsylvania is largely farm county, though it had industrial strength. When I went to school in the farm counties, people, it was like farm counties, grew their food. Today, in the Hanover district in York County, 2/3 of the children are on assisted lunch. 2/3. Dramatic difference from when I was growing up. Daniel, over to you.
Yeah, on the rural question, one of the things that just to give a little historical perspective, in 1800 when Malthus wrote the pamphlet about the Malthusian trap, in order for a society to keep going, north of 3/4 of its population had to be directly involved in food production and in agriculture. And today in the United States, that number is south of 10%. And what that means is that we're in the middle of a 2 centuries long transformation, which is deeply harmful to rural communities. And we need to figure out on a broader scale how to handle rural life in circumstances in which food production is not going to be the dominant economic force in life. And I think infrastructure investment is a big part of this. I also think actually another big part of this is to encourage more environmentally sound, healthful, smaller scale, less corporate farming and food production. That I suspect right now, too small a percentage of our population is working in agriculture and food production because we're valuing a certain kind of scale-based industrial production of food, which is highly privately profitable to the concerns that run it, but not actually particularly good for the environment and not particularly good for the health of the population that eats that food. So that there are real opportunities in rural America to restructure how we make and distribute food. Can I say one thing about partisanship really quickly? And Mary, I wonder what you think about this in particular. I think it's really important to draw a distinction between partisanship and ideological polarization. So ideological polarization concerns the distance of disagreement in some moral space, like how wrong do we think each other are? Whereas partisanship is a kind of tribalism. And we are stuck in a society in America right now with hyper tribal partisanship, even though I don't actually think our ideological polarization is bigger than it used to be. Actually, in 1950, there was the CPUSA. And there were people who were express racist segregationists in American politics. Massive ideological polarization and less partisanship. We've reached a point at which the smallest ideological differences produce enormous partisan tribal disputes. And that's destructive in every way. And I think we need to understand what's driving tribalism rather than what's driving ideology.
Mary, your comment?
Well, the good thing about our political system is it has to keep regenerating itself. And I think that the public is broadly just exhausted, I think, by partisanship, ideological battles. And I hope that it will encourage more people to run for office and to bring, problem solvers as opposed to political ideology battles to the forefront. I think we need a new generation and we need a new approach to solving problems in politics. And I hope the public will stand up for that.
In that regard, Mary, let me turn to our last question, a question we just got from an anonymous attendee. Something I feel strongly about says, please talk about government, how to train, manage, attract the people we need to have to do the things we're suggesting and repair the damage that's been done professional infrastructure within the government, from teachers, scientists, economists. This is a profound, all the questions have been great. This is a profound question, because one thing that has been disgraceful is beating up on the professional government civil servant. When I was in government, the people who worked at the controller's office were really, I would even go so far as to say, noble human beings. They worked hard to, within their lights, to do the right thing for the country. There was no level that was perceptible in any sense of corruption or petty, kind of thing. This was a real civic kind of situation. And I think we've been blessed in government. It's not perfect, just like, any of the political figures that were mentioned, nobody's perfect, but it was something we can all be proud of. The hollowing out of that, including in terms of teachers, as it's said here, and other civil servants, scientists, is absolutely catastrophic. And paying enough of our pay scales for government employees and teachers in particular is insane. With that said, for my 2 cents, let me turn it over to Mary and Daniel.
Well, I obviously had the opportunity to leave the private sector and join the public sector. And at the end of my time, I gave a talk about this very subject, and that I think public service gives you the opportunity to work on some of the most pressing, interesting, challenging issues of our day. And I think that we have an opportunity here to attract into public service some of the smartest minds in our country. And I would love to see, more of a exchange. There's a very negative aura around the term revolving door. I actually think it's very good for people in the private sector to serve in the public sector and to look at things from a different perspective. I also think it's good for people in the public sector to have the experience of working in the private sector. The more we could encourage that, I think more understanding we would have of how to solve problems and how to bridge divides. We tend to be very siloed in our thinking about careers and work and experience, and I would like to see that change.
Daniel?
Well, I've never been in government, so can't speak directly, but I share your sense that career public servants are overwhelmingly deeply honorable people who are working very hard, often at less than the private wage they could get if they worked outside of the government, and to be admired for it. I also think here's a real challenge for our age, which is to find a way simultaneously to honor and respect the knowledge and learning and skill that technocratic elites have, but not to defer to the elites in ways that are undemocratic. And that's something that at the moment our shared cultural and political space is not doing a very good job at doing. On the one hand, you have populists who deny technocratic expertise to the cost of all of us. And on the other hand, you also have, and had for a long time, elites who thought that their expertise gave them an entitlement to make fundamental moral decisions for everybody else. And that wasn't right either. And finding a way to get that balance and to get the democratic people plus technocrats into a productive exchange rather than an unproductive one, I think is a big challenge for our time, and I have no wisdom about how to achieve it.
Well, look, this only raises in my mind the value, importance, and also would be fun having another symposium. At least it includes the two of you. and
as long as you're there, Gene.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't miss it for the world. Even if I'm sitting in the back list just listening. Look, I want to thank Heidi and Politics and Prose for this opportunity to discuss these issues with everybody, and a loyal audience, remarkable to say, through this. And I'm not surprised having Mary and Daniel today, but thank you very much. I can't wait to come over and see you folks and browse the books myself, and I'm sure Daniel and Mary feel the same way. And thank you, Heidi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And everybody, stay open and stay safe.
Here, here.
Thanks for being here. I just want to say a quick thing. I know we had some trouble with the Zoom link. So for anyone who's still with us, as I said multiple times in the chat, this event was recorded in full. Every minute of this fascinating discussion will be on our YouTube channel. I will email you all personally with the link so that you can get it and watch this from the start, because I would hate for you to miss a minute of this conversation. It was really important, eye-opening, and I can sense was just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more here. So I hope everyone will buy Gene's book and Daniel's too, and join us next time here on P&P Live. So thank you all, and be well, stay safe, and stay well read.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, Mary and Daniel.
Bye. Thank you
Thank you.
again.
You too, Heidi.
Thanks.